The carriage turned through Dunmore Hall's iron gates at the last pale hour before dark, when November had stripped the afternoon of its remaining warmth and bled it into the cold. Cecily Nightingale pressed her cheek to the window glass, the chill of it a sharp surprise, and watched the drive unspool between linden trees. They lined the approach in two formal rows, their crowns long emptied, their bare branches reaching like figures in arrested motion across a sky the colour of old pewter. The hall itself appeared first as a silhouette against the fading light. Then, as the carriage closed the distance, it resolved into something more particular. A Jacobean facade of dark Derbyshire gritstone, 3 stories of mullioned windows, most of them unlit. 2 chimneys breathed a thin trail of smoke at the east end. The rest stood cold and stark. The formal parterre garden at the south face was overgrown at its edges, the box hedging uncropped, the late-season growth beginning to blur the geometric lines that had once kept it precise. The effect was less of a house awaiting a visitor than of a house long settled into its own withdrawal, a house that had, somewhere along the way, forgotten the point of appearances. Cecily drew her gloves more firmly over her wrists and straightened her spine against the carriage seat. The agency had provided her with a single sparse paragraph concerning the household. Adelaide Dunmore, 17, was the ward of her elder brother, Leopold Dunmore, the Duke of Ashbourne. The companion position had been vacant for 14 months, following the departure of the previous incumbent under circumstances the agency characterized, after a brief hesitation, as a matter of temperament. There had been 3 companions before her in the previous 2 years. None had remained beyond 8 weeks. The agency offered no further explanation. She hadn't pressed for one. In her experience, the unexplained departures belonged to either the most alarming households or the most interesting, and over 3 years of such positions, she had found the line between alarming and interesting had blurred. She had taken the position because it paid well, and because Bath had offered little in the way of work that suited her abilities or her patience. In the 3 years since her mother's death, she had been a governess in 2 houses, a companion in one, and a reader to an elderly widow who required 4 hours of biography each afternoon and complained, regardless of the narrator's pace, that she was moving too quickly through the interesting parts. Cecily had filed this away as evidence that interesting parts were a matter of definition and moved on. The carriage drew up to the main entrance. She descended before the footman could open the door, her boot finding the wet flagstone just as the wind came around the side of the building with considerable purpose. The housekeeper met her on the steps. A woman of perhaps 55, solid and straight-spined, with iron-grey hair parted severely under a white cap, wearing unornamented black. She identified herself as Mrs. Thorne and offered no supplementary warmth of greeting, a fact Cecily noted without distress. She said, "You'll want to come in out of the weather, Miss Nightingale. Not we are pleased to have you. Not welcome to Dunmore Hall." But the offer of shelter, which was the same thing, expressed without any warmth attached to it. A certain kind of household communicated itself this way. Not cold, exactly, but economical, stripped down to its essential functions. Cecily thanked her and stepped inside. The entrance hall was larger than her previous position in Bath had prepared her for. A vaulted ceiling rose into shadow, and the stone floors were partly covered by a runner of deep burgundy wool, now worn to a darker stripe at its centre from years of passage. A broad staircase ascended behind a carved oak balustrade, the newel posts carved into some heraldic beast she didn't take the time to identify. The walls held portraits in dark frames, a formal line of Dunmore predecessors in oils that had been allowed to darken with age, their faces retreating into shadow. Men and women in the dress of earlier centuries, receding generation by generation into the dimness of unpolished varnish. 2 footmen stood at attention near the stairs, with the particular stillness of men trained to be invisible. A housemaid crossed the upper corridor and disappeared without a downward glance. The air smelled of coal smoke and lemon oil, and faintly of a library. That particular papery density that accumulates in rooms where books have been present long enough to begin returning to the air. Her trunk was carried in by 2 silent men. The sound it made on the stone floor was the loudest thing in the hall for a moment. "His Grace does not attend dinner," Mrs. Thorne said, leading Cecily toward the staircase with a steady pace that invited no dawdling. Miss Adelaide dines at 6 in the East Drawing Room. You will join her there. His Grace takes his meals in private. I see, Cecily said. He conducts estate business in the mornings and is generally in the library or the West Wing in the afternoons. He does not require anything from the companion's position. I understand. Miss Adelaide is a sensible young woman. Something shifted in Mrs. Thorne's voice. Not warmth, but the careful tone a person uses when speaking of someone they have watched over for a long time and have quietly come to regard. She reads a great deal and requires stimulation that her situation here does not readily provide. She has not attended society in some time. Since the accident? Cecily asked. Mrs. Thorne paused on the landing. She turned and looked at Cecily with an expression that was not hostile, but was unmistakably a careful assessment, the kind given to someone who has asked the right question too quickly for comfort. Since the accident, she confirmed. Yes. She resumed her ascent. Cecily's room was in the east corridor, 2 doors from Adelaide's. It was adequately furnished, a narrow bed with a wool coverlet in deep blue, a writing table near the single window, a fireplace in which a fire had been recently laid and now burned with the quiet intention of a thing that had been waiting to be needed. The wardrobe was oak, slightly large for the room. A watercolour hung on the wall above the mantel, a Derbyshire valley in summer, someone's effort to soften the room's austere quality. The window faced the rear grounds. Parkland stretched from the formal garden's edge into a distance that November had emptied of colour, the grass gone to pale gold, the tree line a grey smudge on the horizon. And at the edge of the property, where the oaks gathered most thickly, a stone structure was just visible between the bare branches, a folly in the Gothic style, 2 arches complete, and a third that stopped mid-curve, ending abruptly in open air where the capstone should have been, as though someone had been building and simply stopped, mid-thought, and walked away. She stood at the window for a long moment, looking at it. The agency's single paragraph had said nothing about follies. It had said nothing about piano music, or warming pans carried at midnight, or the particular quality of a household that had arranged itself around a grief it didn't have a name for. These were things you couldn't put in a paragraph. You could only discover them by arriving. Experience in enough households had taught her that the ones that looked closed from the outside were sometimes the ones with the most going on inside, and that the ones that looked entirely orderly were sometimes the ones that had simply gotten very good at presenting an orderly front while everything else went quietly sideways. Dunmore Hall, she thought, was neither of these. It was something more specific, a house in which someone had been very carefully attending to the things that mattered most, and had, in the process, stopped attending to everything else. From somewhere in the east wing below, muffled by stone and corridor and 2 floors of solid Victorian construction, came the sound of a door, not slamming, closing with the careful, deliberate force of a man ensuring that a thing was fully shut, a door that understood itself as a boundary. She unpinned her hat and set it on the writing table. Outside, the dark completed itself over the Derbyshire grounds, and the 2 lit chimneys at the east end of the hall breathed their smoke into a sky that had stopped being sky and become simply the absence of light. She met Adelaide that evening, and recognized in the girl the quality of someone who had been alone too long, with only her own thoughts for company. Adelaide was slight and fair-haired, with a pointed chin and eyes that went straight to your face when she spoke, as though searching for the truth behind the words, rather than merely waiting to hear them. She wore a dress of pale grey wool that had the particular settled quality of a garment, worn for comfort, not company. Upon shaking Cecily's hand, she asked, "Did Mrs. Thorne tell you about the others?" Cecily said she had been told the position had been vacant for some months. 14, Adelaide corrected, the precision of it not unkind, only accurate. She sat back in her chair with the unconscious ease of someone accustomed to filling that chair alone. There were 3 before the 14 months. Miss Pringle lasted 8 weeks, Miss Abbott 6, Mrs. Hargreaves 4 days, but she was sent away so quickly I barely had time to learn how she took her tea. Why was Mrs. Hargreaves sent away so quickly? Cecily asked. Adelaide was quiet for a moment, studying the tablecloth. Then she looked up. She was indelicate. She asked Leopold about his face. Cecily poured her own tea and said nothing. He didn't shout, Adelaide added, as though this were a material detail. "Leopold never shouts. He simply said, 'I believe your services will not be required.'" And Mrs. Thorne had her bags on the morning coach. Cecily nodded and reached for a bread roll from the side table. "You aren't going to ask me about it," Adelaide said. "About what?" "His face, the accident, that is what you are wondering about." Cecily considered her. "You will tell me what you choose to tell me, and I will learn what I need to from what I observe. I am not here to ask questions about things that do not belong to my position." Adelaide studied her for a long moment, in the way of someone accustomed to being managed by adults and alert to the specific difference between management and genuine attention. Then, with something that might have been the early stages of relief, she picked up her own bread roll. "Good," she said, and after a pause, "The trollop on the third shelf is mine. You may borrow it if you ask." The Duke appeared the following morning. Cecily was crossing the upper corridor at 8 o'clock, carrying Adelaide's shawl from the linen room, when a door at the far end of the east wing opened. She had a moment's notice, the click of the handle, the slight expansion of light from within. And then he was in the corridor, and she had her full impression of him before either of them spoke. She had been told he was 36. He appeared to have arrived at that age by a route that had demanded considerable things of him along the way. He was tall, broad across the shoulder, dressed in a plain dark frock coat over a grey waistcoat with no cravat, a concession to mourning, or perhaps a man who had ceased to regard cravats as a matter requiring daily decision. His hair was black and had been pushed back from his forehead with the imprecision of someone who had not consulted a mirror, or had consulted it and decided against revisions. The scar ran from just below his left temple, down across the cheekbone and along the jaw, ending near his chin. It was healed to a pale seam, old enough to be long past crisis, new enough to still read clearly on his skin. His right side was unmarked, a straight jaw, a precisely cut mouth, the dark, strong brow of his Dunmore ancestors in the portraits downstairs. His eyes were set at a slight distance, and had been trained, she thought, to register rather than express. He stopped when he saw her. She stopped when she saw him. Neither of them made any visible adjustment to their expression. She noted this in him immediately, and recognized from the quality of his stillness that he was accustomed to watching other people adjust theirs. The sharp intake of breath, the quick glance away, the elaborate performance of not looking, and was waiting for her to begin that performance now. She said, "Good morning, Your Grace. Miss Nightingale." His voice was low and had been calibrated, she thought, over several years, to conceal emotion. Not by warmth, but by flatness, the voice of a man who had learned that affect gave other people handholds. He crossed the corridor toward the staircase, a path that would take him within a few feet of her. "I trust Mrs. Thorne has explained the household's arrangements." "She has." "Then we understand one another." He was 2 steps past her when she spoke again. "She mentioned you take your meals privately." He stopped. He did not turn. "Yes." "She didn't say why." A pause. "It isn't a matter requiring explanation." "No," she agreed. "I mention it only because Miss Adelaide would benefit from company at dinner, when you choose to provide it." He turned then. The full turn, facing her directly in the corridor's pale morning light, the scar on the left, the unmarked side on the right, both of them present and in view. He looked at her with the expression of a man who had expected a subject to be dropped and had discovered, to his particular irritation, that it was not going to be. "That," he said, "is not your concern." "My concern is Miss Adelaide's well-being," she replied. "I am identifying the simplest possible improvement to it." Something moved behind his expression. Not anger, precisely. It was closer to surprise, but a surprise that had been trained for so long to present as irritation that it had ceased to notice the distinction. He held her gaze for a moment longer than was comfortable, or a moment longer than her predecessors had likely allowed before looking away. She did not look away. Then he said, "Good morning, Miss Nightingale," and went down the stairs. She stood in the corridor with Adelaide's shawl, listening to his footsteps cross the entrance hall below, the library door open, and then close. She remained in the corridor for a moment longer than necessary. Not from uncertainty. She knew precisely where she was going and why, but because something in that exchange required a breath before she moved past it. He had expected her to retreat. She had seen it in the calculation that preceded his turning, the half-second pause, the angle of his chin, the way a man holds himself when he is about to say something he has predicted, from long experience, will end the conversation. She had not retreated, and this had unsettled him. It produced not hostility, but something she recognized from years of navigating other people's resistance as the earliest possible evidence of reconsideration. Not change, nowhere near it, but the precondition of it. The moment when a fixed position discovers that the ground it stands on might bear investigation. She filed this, as she filed most things, without attaching more significance to it than it warranted, and returned to Adelaide's room. Adelaide told her about the accident over 2 afternoons the following week. It did not come out in one sitting, but in the incremental way significant things were revealed in households where they had been unspoken for long enough to require a careful approach. 6 years ago. A carriage on the Buxton Road in February, a patch of ice invisible from the coachman's position. The inside rear wheel caught a drift at speed, and the carriage tipped onto its left side with the particular violent slowness of large objects failing. Adelaide had not been inside. She had been at school in Harrogate. Leopold had been travelling with his then-fiancée, Miss Constance Mercer of the Kensington Mercers, and her aunt, as chaperone. The aunt had escaped with a badly wrenched shoulder. Miss Mercer had sustained a broken wrist. Leopold had braced himself against the door as the carriage turned and had taken the full force of the shattered window glass across the left side of his face. She broke the engagement within the month, Adelaide said on the second afternoon. She said it without visible emotion, which Cecily had learned was its own form of feeling in the Dunmore household. Constance. She wrote to him. He never spoke of it. I only know because I was 15 and I read the letter. It was left on the study table. I hadn't yet learned not to read things left unguarded. A pause. I don't think it was an accident, that it was left there. But I've never been certain. What did the letter say? Cecily asked. Adelaide looked down at her teacup. That she had given the matter careful consideration, that her family felt, and she had come to agree, that the change to his appearance constituted a materially altered circumstance, that she trusted he would understand. Cecily said nothing. He wrote back, Adelaide said. I didn't read that one. I wish I had. That evening Cecily went to the library. It was a long-standing habit. She had always read late, having spent years in households where the evening hours, after the family retired, belonged entirely to her. She had learned to treat that time with the same seriousness she applied to the rest of her working day. The Dunmore Library occupied the full length of the ground floor's south wing, 2 stories of shelving reached by a narrow iron gallery stair. The lower shelves were dark oak, the upper a lighter wood that suggested a later addition. Gas lamps had been turned to their lowest setting. She brought a candlestick from a hall sconce to light her way. She found Trollope on the second shelf, took down the first volume of The Way We Live Now, which she had not read, and settled in the chair nearest the fireplace where the coals still held an adequate warmth. She had read perhaps 40 pages, immersed enough in Melmotter's various frauds to have lost track of the hour, when the door opened. She didn't look up immediately. When she did, the Duke was standing 3 feet inside the room, arrested in the act of entering as though the room had presented him with an unexpected development. He was in his shirt sleeves. No waistcoat, no coat, the collar open at the throat. He held a glass in his left hand and had clearly come to the library expecting to find it empty, as he had presumably found it every evening he had chosen to visit it. He said nothing. She broke the silence. I apologize. I was not told the library was closed after hours. It isn't. His voice had the particular flatness of a man recalibrating without wanting to appear to do so. Then I will stay, she said, and returned to her book. A silence followed. She turned a page. She heard him cross to the far set of shelves, the section furthest from her toward the south wall, and take down a volume. The slight drag of a spine against its neighbors, the soft settle of leather in a hand that knew how to hold a book. She did not watch him do it. He remained standing. She registered this as the posture of a man who had not yet decided whether to stay. She turned another page. Melmotta was buying a house in Grosvenor Square. The prose moved at Trollope's characteristic comfortable pace, neither rushing nor loitering, confident in the reader's willingness to follow. After approximately 3 minutes, she heard him move to the chair at the other side of the fireplace, positioned at a significant remove from hers, a deliberate distance, and the leather creaked under his weight. She did not look up. He did not speak. They read, or appeared to read, for the better part of an hour. The fire settled lower into the grate. The clock on the mantel marked the half-hour. At some point the wind came up outside and pressed briefly against the south windows, then retreated. The gas lamp on the near wall flickered in some small draught and steadied. When she finally closed the volume and rose to leave, she said, "Good night, Your Grace." From behind his book, without looking up, he replied, "Miss Nightingale." She carried her candlestick back to the east corridor and lay awake for some time in the dark, thinking of the folly at the edge of the grounds, its stopped arch, the gap of sky where the capstone should have closed the curve. And she found herself understanding something she had not needed to be told. The man who had sat in the library for an hour with no reason to stay, except that leaving would have acknowledged something he wasn't prepared to acknowledge, was not a man who had decided that no one would ever sit in a room with him. He was a man who had decided, with the thoroughness of someone who had reached a conclusion through genuine suffering, that he was not permitted to want anyone to. There was a difference, and the difference was the most important thing she had yet learned about Dunmore Hall. Adelaide developed a fever on Thursday. It came on in the morning and moved quickly toward its full statement by early afternoon. The particular velocity of fevers in young people whose bodies, given insufficient outlets, had channeled too much energy into still, interior hours. By 2 o'clock, she was confined to bed, flushed and restless, oscillating between insisting she was perfectly well and admitting, when pressed, that her head felt filled with river water. Cecily sent for Dr. Hale. The message came back through his surgery's assistant. The doctor was attending a difficult confinement on the Bakewell Road, 12 miles north, and could not be expected before morning at the earliest. The note added, with the apologetic precision of a man who had learned to manage expectations through a subordinate, that it might be 2 days, depending on conditions. The conditions did not improve. Snow had begun at noon, a steady and determined fall that covered the gravel drive in layers, obscuring the path to the gate by 3 o'clock, and continuing to accumulate into the early evening with no intention of stopping. Cecily went to the kitchen and spoke with the cook about broth, clear, well salted, with a small quantity of good stock added at the end. She went to the linen room, found a small brass warming pan, and brought it up to Adelaide's room. She laid fresh covers on the bed, pulled the heaviest chair in the corridor to a position beside the fire, and settled in to read aloud. Adelaide had chosen a novel by Mrs. Henry Wood, something lighter than Trollope. A domestic romance with sufficient incident to hold the attention without demanding too much of it. Cecily kept her voice even and well-paced, the kind of reading that asked nothing of the listener except to receive it. Adelaide slept in fits. Cecily kept the fire built and exchanged the warming pan at intervals. At 10:30, the door opened. She had been in the process of replacing a cooling cloth on Adelaide's forehead with a fresh one from the basin of water she'd kept near the grate, wringing it to damp and folding it to the correct width, when the movement crossed the edge of her vision. She turned without urgency. Leopold stood in the doorway. He held in his left hand a second warming pan, the copper sort, larger and heavier than the brass one she'd been using, the kind that held its heat considerably longer. In his right, he held a small bottle of brown glass she recognized as camphor oil, used for chest complaints and the accompanying difficulty of breath. She said, "Bring it in. The one I have been using was losing its heat." He crossed to the grate and set the copper pan to warm without speaking. He set the camphor oil on the bedside table, placing it with care so it wouldn't tip, and then looked at Adelaide, who was sleeping with the visible effort of someone fighting her own body's restlessness. "How long has she been like this?" he asked. "Since this morning. The temperature has been high since noon." She ate nothing at dinner. It was not a question. He had checked, then had asked Mrs. Thorne or the kitchen, had tracked it from a distance. "Half a bowl of broth," Cecily said. "She managed the broth." He nodded. He was looking at Adelaide with an expression she would not have called readable from across a corridor, but here, in the close space of a sick room at 10:30, with no professional distance between them, it was entirely readable. He was frightened. The controlled, practiced variety, the kind a person wore when they had been frightened before and had learned to hold it correctly, without letting it become panic. But frightened all the same. "I nursed my mother through pleurisy the winter before last," she said. She had not planned to say it. It came out because it was the relevant thing. "I know when to be concerned and when to wait." He looked at her. "Tonight is for waiting," she said. "She is young and strong, and she has had good care today. Her color will change before morning." He was quiet for a long moment. Then, "You are certain." "Certain enough." He moved to the wall nearest the window and settled there, in the manner of a man who had decided to stay, but did not want to take space that wasn't his. She changed the warming pans with efficient movements, the brass one withdrawn to the hearth, the copper one wrapped and placed at Adelaide's feet. She checked the cloth on the girl's forehead, replaced it again. She sat back in her chair and took up the missus. Wood again, reading silently this time, keeping her own thoughts occupied so they could not accumulate into worry. Leopold remained at the wall. She was peripherally aware of him as a stillness in the room. Not an intrusion, she realized, but a presence that had chosen its location carefully, in the place where it could see Adelaide and could be seen to be there without inserting itself into the work. At midnight, Adelaide's fever broke. The high color receded. A long, slow exhale, perspiration on her brow, the shallow, restless breathing deepening into something more substantial and purposeful. She woke briefly, asked for water in a voice considerably more her own than it had been, drank carefully, and settled into a sleep that had the quality of a battle won. Cecily sat back in the chair and let the tension go from her shoulders. Leopold straightened from the wall. "She will sleep well now," Cecily said. "Yes." His voice was lower than usual, with something careful around its edges. She looked at him. He was still looking at Adelaide, with the same expression she had learned in the past hour to recognize as love in its most unguarded, unpretty form. Not tender exactly, the kind that had sharp edges because it had been living with fear for company. "Go to bed, Your Grace," she said, not unkindly. "I will sit until 2. Mrs. Thorne will come through after." He did not go immediately. He looked at Adelaide once more, taking a moment longer than a man who meant to appear unaffected would allow, and then he was at the door. "Miss Nightingale," he said. "Your Grace." He stood in the doorway for a moment. The corridor's darkness was behind him, the fire's warmth in the room, and between them was the charged quality of a silence in which something had been decided without being said. Then he went. She sat with Adelaide until 2 and found for the first time since arriving at Dunmore Hall that the house had exhaled somewhere by a fraction. Adelaide was back to her books by Saturday and pronounced herself entirely well on Sunday, with the uncompromising confidence of the recently ill who require others to stop noticing their recovery. Something in the hall changed after that Thursday night, though it changed the way weather changed in Derbyshire in November, not obviously, not by announcement, but by a gradual shift in the quality of the air, a loosening of some atmospheric pressure that had been present for so long it had ceased to register as anything other than the ordinary state of things. The Duke's movements altered, not dramatically. His door opened at a slightly different hour in the mornings. His route from the west wing to the library, which she had previously calculated from the sound of his footsteps to take the passage that avoided any intersection with her daily rounds, began to take the east corridor route instead. On Wednesday, he appeared at the east drawing-room door at 6 o'clock. He stood in the doorway for precisely the length of time required to make a final calculation, and then he sat in the chair at the head of the table. Adelaide said, "Good. I have been wanting someone to settle a question about the trollop," as though this were a previously scheduled event that had simply been delayed. They discussed the trollop for 40 minutes. Cecily spoke when she had something to contribute and not otherwise. The Duke's contributions were infrequent but precise. He had read everything Adelaide had been reading, she gathered either from memory or in parallel, and he did not fill silences for their own sake. By the following week, Thursday dinner had become unremarkable. The pattern settled without any of them acknowledging that a pattern had been established. On Friday morning, walking the grounds after Adelaide's reading hour, Cecily came upon him at the rear garden's edge. He was standing where the formal path turned toward the parkland, hands clasped behind his back, in the position she had come to recognize as his habitual containment posture, looking toward the tree line. He did not hear her approach until she was within a few yards, at which point he turned with the unhurried rotation of a man who does not allow himself to startle. They stood for a moment in the crisp air. "Good morning," she said. "Miss Nightingale." She looked in the direction he had been facing. The oaks were bare, the parkland grass pale and silvered with frost at the edges. Between the trees, the folly was visible at its usual distance, the completed arches the stopped third one. "The folly is through the oaks?" she asked. "A quarter mile. I have been watching it from my window, the unfinished side." He said nothing. "Adelaide mentioned the construction stopped," she said. Around the time of the accident, she thought. A pause settled between them, in which she registered that she had said something he had not expected her to address directly. His shoulders drew in by the very smallest degree, not a retreat, she thought. Wariness, the posture of a man calculating how much the approaching subject was going to cost him. "It was my father's project," he said after a moment. "He began it the year before he died. I intended to complete it when I inherited. The accident intervened. And after, I did not resume it. Why not?" He turned and looked at her, a direct look, with the quality of a question being considered very carefully before a response was given. "I am not certain," he said. She thought that this was probably the most honest thing he had said to her since she arrived. She fell into step beside him on the path toward the oaks. Neither of them had suggested it, nor did they comment on the fact that it was happening. The ground underfoot was hard with old frost, the air clean and cold and still. A wood pigeon rustled somewhere in the higher branches, and was silent again. She had walked with men who filled silences as a matter of policy, a conversational maintenance, performed not because they had something to say, but because silence made them uneasy. Leopold was not this. He was quiet in the specific manner of someone who had considered speaking and decided the present moment did not require it. It made the walk a different thing, something purposeful, with both of them present in it rather than one of them managing the other's experience of being outside in November. She found in the space of that quarter mile that she was not performing attentiveness. She was simply attending. To the texture of the frost-killed grass, the quality of the air against her face, the long pale line of the property wall in the middle distance, visible through the bare trunks. It had been some time since she had been in a situation that allowed for that. The folly emerged between the trees as they came through the final stand of oaks, a stone pavilion in the Gothic style, 2 arches completed with their full curve and capstones intact, a third arch rising and stopping at mid-curve, the stonework ending in a clean, decisive line against the pale sky. There was no rubble, no abandoned materials. The stopping was too neat for accident, too deliberate for a project merely interrupted. Someone had finished what they intended to finish, and then stopped precisely where they had reached the edge of their intention. She stood and looked at it. "It could be finished," she said. He stood beside her, 2 feet of cold November air between them. "Yes. Will you?" He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then, "Perhaps." It was not much, but it was the first perhaps she had heard from him that was not a door closing. The following week, Adelaide announced, with the careful timing of someone who had been planning a suggestion, that she would very much like to see the folly properly. She had been looking at it from her own window for 6 years and had never been taken there, she declared. Would Cecily accompany her? And could Leopold come also, because she required someone tall enough to assess whether the open top of the unfinished arch presented any structural danger to those standing beneath it. Leopold said he had estate matters in the afternoon. Adelaide replied, "You have estate matters every afternoon, Leopold." He looked at his ward with the expression of a man who had spent 17 years understanding precisely how Adelaide's mind worked and finding it difficult to dispute its conclusions in good conscience. They went on Saturday. The afternoon light came at a low angle through the oaks, an amber warmth unusual for November, catching the pale gritstone of the Follies' completed arches and turning them briefly golden. Adelaide walked ahead on the path, maintaining a pace of apparent casual interest in her surroundings, glancing at the frost patterns on the dead bracken, pausing once to examine a bird's nest in a low branch that was too precisely calibrated to be accidental. She was giving them distance. She was not subtle about it. She had apparently decided that subtlety was not her most pressing obligation. Cecily walked beside Leopold on the narrow path. He did not speak for the first quarter mile. She had no requirement for him to. The oaks bore their winter aspect in silence. The ground underfoot was soft where the frost had lifted, and still firm where it hadn't. The cold had a particular quality in the late afternoon of carrying sound very far and very clearly, so that their footsteps were the loudest thing in the landscape. Adelaide disappeared around a bend in the path. He said, "She is not subtle." "No," Cecily agreed. "It does not concern you?" "That Adelaide is transparent in her loyalties?" She thought about it. "She loves you, and she thinks you need someone to intervene on your behalf. She is probably right. The fact that her method is obvious does not reduce its sincerity." He said nothing. The Folly emerged between the trees. Adelaide was already there, standing at the base of the unfinished arch, with her hands on her hips and her chin tipped back, assessing the gap in the stonework with the pragmatic air of a girl who has decided the structural question is genuinely interesting, regardless of the other purposes it served. "It is solid," she said, without turning. "The stones look absolutely sound. It is simply unfinished." "Yes," Leopold said from behind her. Adelaide, having fulfilled the technical requirement of her stated purpose, announced she would walk the perimeter of the pavilion to examine it from all angles, and made herself efficiently unavailable around the far corner of the structure. Cecily stood before the stopped arch. Leopold stood beside her. The afternoon light caught the Follies' stonework and lengthened their shadows across the dead grass. The gap at the top of the third arch held a rectangle of pale sky, luminous in the way of overcast days with no direct sun, the kind of light that clarified everything without flattering anything. She looked at the unfinished curve for a while. "You look at it differently than most people do," he said at some point. "How do most people look at it? As though it represents something, as though they are waiting for me to speak to what it means. Does it represent something?" He was quiet, not the guarded variety of quiet, but the more open kind, which she had observed was harder for him. "It was something my father wanted very much to build," he said. "I thought completing it was an obligation I owed him. Then the accident. Afterward." A pause. There seemed very little point in finishing something to stand in a park that no one visited. "You visit it," she said. He looked at her. The directness of it, a thing he had deployed against her since the first morning in the corridor, the kind of look that moved the work of assessment into the open and dared you to return it, landed differently here, without stone walls and household formality around it. It landed as something he was not entirely in control of. The scar was fully visible in this light. The long pale seam from temple to chin, the way the healed skin moved slightly differently from the unmarked side when his jaw tensed. She looked at it with the attention she gave to things she was genuinely interested in understanding, not staring, not the elaborate performance of deliberate non-staring. Simply looking, as she would look at anything present in the landscape that had its own history and its own meaning. He noticed. He looked away first. "Miss Nightingale," he said, his voice dropping slightly, "I would ask you—" He stopped. Not to what? A pause. He turned away from the arch, facing the oaks, his hands going to their habitual position clasped behind his back. A containment that was, in this moment, visibly insufficient. "You look at me," he said, "in a way I am unaccustomed to. I have spent considerable time categorizing the ways in which people look at me since the accident, and I know each of them with some precision. Pity, which presents as deliberate kindness and averted eyes. Discomfort, which presents as excessive warmth, the compensatory variety. Morbid interest, which presents as the opposite of averted eyes. And then an elaborate, rather tiring performance that some people undertake of appearing not to see the scar at all, which requires more visible effort than simply seeing it. A pause. You do none of these. What you do, I cannot name. And I would ask you to see you clearly, she supplied. He turned back. Both sides of his face, the full visible fact of him in the November afternoon, and something behind his expression had begun to shift. I am not interested in your scar, she said. She said it plainly as a statement, not a reassurance. I am interested in the man who stops a folly mid-arch and does not resume it, who carries warming pans at midnight and sets them down carefully so they do not make a sound, who sat in the library for an hour in the worst chair in the room, because going back to his own study was worse than a company he insisted he had not sought. Something crossed his face. Not pain, exactly. Adjacent to it, with something else beneath, the texture of a thing that has been held down for a very long time beginning to move. He said quietly, "You are making an argument for something that does not exist." What does not exist? Somewhere around the far side of the pavilion, Adelaide's footsteps moved with unhurried purpose, giving them time, as deliberate as breathing. When he spoke, it came out low and precise, in the voice of a man who has rehearsed nothing and is consequently saying the unguarded version of a long-considered truth. A beast like me can't be loved, Miss Nightingale. I have made a careful study of the evidence. Constance Mercer understood this before I did. Society understood it the moment they saw my face. I am not asking for your sympathy. I am stating a conclusion I arrived at through observation and have tested sufficiently to regard as settled. He said it without self-pity. That was the most difficult thing about it. The flatness of it, the certainty, the specific tone of a man who has genuinely accepted something he believes to be true and has ceased, in his accepting, to require it to be otherwise. She looked at him. Then she said, "Then I'll love the beast." He stared at her, not with alarm, not with the shuttered politeness of a man declining an unwelcome offer. He stared at her the way a man stares when words have arrived, in a language he had stopped expecting anyone to speak to him, a language he had believed extinguished in his vicinity through pure attrition, and found himself unexpectedly understanding every word. She held his gaze in the flat amber light of the November afternoon, with Adelaide's footsteps still unhurried somewhere behind the stone, with the cold settled into the bare oaks, with the full fact of his face and hers between them, and nothing else. After a long moment he looked away. "You should not say such things," he said, his voice not quite steady. "I say what I mean." He did not answer. He walked, not ran, not hurried, but walked, with the deliberate pace of a man who has decided something and is removing himself from its vicinity with the care that a decision of that magnitude requires. Back toward the path through the oaks, back toward the house, his shoulders held with a control that was visible even at a distance. Adelaide came around the corner of the pavilion. She looked at the path where Leopold had gone. She looked at Cecily. She said nothing, which was its own volume of communication. Cecily looked at the unfinished arch for a while longer. The gap of sky through it was very clear and very pale, the stopped curve of stone pointing toward nothing in particular and everything in general, as unfinished things tended to do. Then she turned and followed the path back toward the house. He withdrew, not completely. The Thursday dinners continued, because Adelaide would have made their absence unignorable, and Leopold had the capacity to endure a great deal, but not, apparently, the sustained, visible disappointment of the person in the world who knew him best. He came to dinner, he spoke when spoken to, and he departed immediately after. But the morning routes changed back. The library, when she visited it in the evenings, was empty. The door at the end of the east wing corridor closed at the same careful hour each night and did not open again. Mrs. Thorne observed everything and said nothing, which was her particular excellence. Adelaide said on Monday, "He does this." "I know," Cecily said. "He gets close to something and then he walks away from it at great speed, and then he convinces himself that the walking was the sensible choice." A pause. "He has been doing it for 6 years. Rooms, people, projects, the folly." She turned the page of her botanical reference with more force than the turning required. "I should very much like to shake him." "I would not recommend it," Cecily said. "You would not recommend it because it would not work, or because you think he will come back on his own?" Cecily considered the question honestly. Because some things have to be chosen without being pushed toward. If you push him, he will decide it was pressure rather than preference, and the decision will not hold. Adelaide was quiet for a moment. That is rather wise and rather annoying, she said. I know, Cecily agreed. She worked. She took Adelaide through French grammar in the mornings, The Reign of George III in the afternoons, and Collins's The Moonstone in the evenings, which Adelaide found genuinely compelling, and which occupied several dinner conversations with Leopold at a level of intellectual engagement that was the nearest thing to ease she had observed between them. She ordered botanical specimens from a Bakewell supplier, dried specimens mounted on card, suitable for identification and pressing, and they cleared a long table in the conservatory. There they arranged them in the pale December light, cataloguing them by family and species in a ledger Adelaide kept, with the seriousness of someone who had found a project that asked something real of her. The week passed, then the next. On Tuesday of the second week, a letter arrived. Mrs. Penfold, the widowed lady in whose Bath household Cecily had been employed for 18 months before the agency posted her to Derbyshire, had developed a pulmonary inflammation. The letter was written in Mrs. Penfold's hand, which was thinner than Cecily remembered, and took more space than usual on the page, the marks of a woman writing from a reclined position with insufficient surface beneath the paper. She was asking Cecily to come back. She said she trusted no one else's judgment in medical matters and offered to make the arrangement worth Cecily's inconvenience. She also said, in the final paragraph, with the directness of a woman who had managed her own affairs for 30 years and saw no point in oblique requests, "I have no one else, my dear." Her niece in Bristol had not visited in 8 months. This was also, though she did not say it explicitly, a request for Cecily to be honest with herself about where she was needed. Cecily folded the letter, set it on her writing table and looked at it for some time. Then she went to find Mrs. Thorne. She said she needed to speak with the Duke. Mrs. Thorne said she would inquire as to his availability and returned 20 minutes later with the information that he would receive her in the study at 5 o'clock. The study was in the West Wing. She had not been in it before. It was a working room, smaller than the library, a desk occupied with correspondence and estate ledgers, arranged in the particular organized density of a man who managed large amounts of paper and required it to remain navigable. A single lamp on the desk, bookshelves on 2 walls, the books here practical rather than literary, agricultural surveys, county records, legal reference volumes, a fire recently built. He was standing when she entered, which she recognized as a choice. She told him about the letter. She said she was obligated to consider the request, given the nature of her previous employment and the urgency of the circumstances. She said she thought a fortnight was adequate notice, time for the agency to identify a replacement for Adelaide or for other arrangements to be considered. He listened to all of this with his hands clasped behind his back, standing near the window that overlooked the west garden, his expression fully controlled. She watched him listen and registered, beneath the control, the specific quality of a man who has heard exactly what he expected to hear, and is not going to allow himself to be surprised by the degree to which it costs him. When she finished, he said, "I understand." 2 words, flat and final and costing him, she thought, rather more than they appeared to. She waited, in case there was anything further. There was not. She said, "I will write to the agency tomorrow." "Yes," he said. "Mrs. Thorne will assist with the arrangements." She thanked him, turned, and was at the door when he said her name. "Miss Nightingale." She turned back. He was looking at her. The controlled expression remained, but around his eyes was a tension that was not anger, not closure, not the deliberate flatness of a man performing composure. It was something else, something that had been held against gravity for some time and was beginning very slightly to show the weight of the holding. "Adelaide will miss you," he said. "I will miss her," Cecily said, and then, "I will miss Dunmore Hall." He nodded once and looked back at the window. She went back to her room. That night, past midnight, she heard the piano. It came from somewhere below, the west drawing room, where she had seen the instrument on her first day with its lid down, and its surface bearing only a thin accumulation of dust. the dust of an object present but not used. The piece began slowly, formally, an air she couldn't name, something from the period of her parents' youth, a drawing-room piece, a thing composed for competent hands in domestic settings. The sort of thing young men of Leopold's class and generation learned in childhood, pressed into the discipline of it before they were old enough to know whether they enjoyed it, and then continuing, if they were the sort who continued, past the point of discipline into the territory of genuine feeling. Then it moved gradually away from formality, into something she could not identify because it had no likely source, something shaped by feeling rather than composition, the particular music of a man alone in a room in the middle of the night who has stopped performing for any theoretical listener. She lay in the dark of her room and listened. She did not get up to stand in the corridor. She did not go downstairs. She recognized, with a clarity that surprised her by its steadiness, that going downstairs would be the wrong thing, that this was the sound of a man working something out in the only language he had left for it, and that witnesses would change the nature of what was being worked out. She pressed her hand flat to the coverlet, felt the familiar slight texture of the wool beneath her fingers, and she listened until the music slowed and stopped. Then she listened to the silence that followed. She thought of all the things he had stopped, the folly, the dinners, the library evenings, the morning walks in the frost, the piano. She thought of what it would take to resume them, and she understood, in a way she had not quite understood before, that the question was not whether he was capable of resuming them. The question was whether he believed resuming them was something he was allowed to do, whether permission, from somewhere, from someone whose opinion he could trust, had ever been offered. She turned toward the window. The night was very quiet, very cold, and entirely dark. In the morning, she wrote the letter to the agency. 2 weeks passed with the quality of weeks in which time is being used for something other than its ordinary purposes. Not wasted, not empty, but occupied with a kind of internal accounting that left the surface of daily life undisturbed while conducting, somewhere beneath it, a reckoning that was taking more energy than it appeared to. Adelaide did not speak directly about the departure. She had decided on dignity, which was the Dunmore response to things that mattered too much to approach head-on, and she exercised it with some effort. She did, however, propose that they finish the botanical collection before Cecily left, framing it as a project with a clear deadline, which it was, and which had no bearing whatsoever on her feelings about the deadline, which she knew and Cecily knew, and neither of them remarked upon. They pressed the final specimens on Thursday. Adelaide labelled each mount in her careful hand and arranged them in the ledger in a sequence that was both taxonomically correct and, in its final order, quietly beautiful. She closed the ledger when they were done and kept her hand on its cover for a moment. Cecily did not say anything. Adelaide said, "You may borrow the trollop for the journey." "Thank you," Cecily said. "He has read it too," Adelaide said, "so there will be something to discuss, later if there is occasion." Cecily looked at her. Adelaide met her look with the clear-eyed directness that had been her best quality from the first evening, the quality of someone who had decided to be honest rather than simply strategic. "There is always occasion," Adelaide said, "for people who choose to make one." The agency confirmed a Miss Barton from Nottingham. She would arrive the 3rd week of January. Cecily's trunk came out of the wardrobe corner and was packed over 3 days in the careful, incremental way of someone who was not in a hurry to finish the task. On the Thursday before her last day, she went to dinner and found only Adelaide at the table. Leopold had sent word through Mrs. Thorne, a tenant matter urgent, unavoidable. His place was set. His chair remained empty through the meal. On Saturday morning at her last day, the trunk stood in the entrance hall by 9 o'clock. The carriage had been ordered for 11. The morning was grey and still, the first real cold of December settling over the Derbyshire landscape with the authority of a season that had made up its mind. Adelaide came down at 9:30 and did not cry, which was harder than crying. Mrs. Thorne shook Cecily's hand with the formality of a woman who had arrived, over the preceding weeks, at something that would not be called warmth, but which was its elder, more reliable sibling. The footman carried her bag to the door. Cecily put on her coat. She pulled on her left glove. She reached for her hat from the hall table. Footsteps sounded on the staircase. Not the purposeful, brisk footsteps of a man moving through his household on estate business. These were the unhurried footsteps of a man who has made a decision and, having made it, has decided to arrive at its execution without apparent haste. The particular pace of someone who is not going to permit urgency to make the thing seem smaller than it is. Leopold came down the staircase. He was dressed formally, frock coat, cravat correctly tied, the dark waistcoat buttoned to the last button, dressed for the morning in a way that the morning had not previously required of him. He reached the bottom of the staircase and stopped. Adelaide, to Cecily's left, went very still. From somewhere in the rear of the hall, Mrs. Thorne found something elsewhere to attend to. He stood in the entrance hall and looked at Cecily. "I find I am unable to allow this to occur without saying something." She waited. He was quiet for a moment, not gathering words, she thought, but allowing himself to arrive at the place from which words could be said honestly. She had seen him do this before, in the sick room at midnight, at the Folly in the afternoon light. The pause before the unguarded version. "I have spent 6 years in this house," he said, making a very persuasive case that isolation was a preference rather than a fear. "I had sufficient years of practice at it to become genuinely persuasive. I persuaded myself first, which is the necessary step." A pause. "You did not find me persuasive." She said nothing. "At the Folly," he said, "what you said. I have thought of very little else for the past 2 weeks, not because I doubt you meant it. A breath. Because I believe you entirely. You do not say things you do not mean. I know this about you now. Whatever else, I have made it my business not to know. And that is precisely the difficulty, because it means there is no comfortable category in which to place it and leave it there." The entrance hall held the cold coming through the open front door, the waiting carriage on the drive, the weight of a morning in which a decision was being made in full sight of everyone present. "I am afraid," he said. He said it plainly, without apology for the admission, with the directness of a man who has decided that honest statement is the only remaining currency available to him. "I have been afraid for a long time, and fear is a house you can occupy for long enough that you mistake the walls for your own bones and stop noticing that there are windows. I am—" He stopped. "I am grateful for what you have done in this house since October, for Adelaide, for the warming pans, for the library, for the Folly, for looking at me the way I had stopped expecting anyone to look at me, and finding that I had apparently been waiting for it without knowing I was still capable of waiting." He took one step toward her. A single, careful step. Not a stride, not an advance, but the step of a man testing whether the ground will hold. "I do not want you to go," he said. "I am uncertain what I am asking. I have spent several nights at the piano and several more staring at the ceiling, attempting to determine what I am asking, and the full articulation of it remains somewhat beyond my present capacity." The corner of his mouth moved, briefly, barely. "But I know what I am not asking. I am not asking you to return in the same capacity. I am not asking you to remain for Adelaide's sake, though that would also be true and welcome. I am asking because this house was—" He paused. "Different. Since October. I was different, and I find that I am unwilling to let that stop." He stood very still. Both sides of his face in the grey morning light of the entrance hall, the unmarked jaw, the pale seam from temple to chin, the dark hair, the careful eyes that held, in this moment, neither hope nor resignation, but something more specific and more difficult. A man waiting for a verdict and having decided, for the first time in 6 years, to receive it without having arranged the outcome in advance. Cecily looked at him for a long moment. She had been in rooms where important things were said, and had watched them dissolve because nobody present was willing to move first. She had seen the particular paralysis that sets in when two people stand at the edge of something real, and each waits for the other to cross it, and the waiting becomes eventually the decision. She had promised herself a long time ago in a less complicated life that she would not do that. That when she understood something clearly, and the moment asked something of her, she would move. She set her hat on the hall table. She pulled off her right glove, one finger at a time, the way she did things she intended to do carefully. She crossed to him, 3 steps, the stone floor solid underfoot, the cold from the open door on the back of her neck, and put her ungloved hand against his left cheek. The scar side, the deliberate choice of the scar side, because she had meant what she said at the Folly, and because she understood that what she had meant only counted if she demonstrated it without flinching. His breath caught. Under her palm, a muscle in his jaw flexed. The warmth of his skin in the cold morning air, the faint raised texture of old scar tissue, and beside it, the ordinary surface of a man's face. "Leopold," she said, the first time she had used his name, not your grace, the name underneath the title, the one that belonged to the person rather than the position. He closed his eyes. When he opened them, what was generally held behind his expression was visible. Not dissolved, not finished with him, not the kind of thing that disappears because a woman has put her hand on his face, but present in the way it actually was, large and old and patient and willing now to be seen without being managed. He raised his hand and placed it over hers. Warm through the cold of the morning, careful around her fingers, the pressure of a man who has decided that something offered to him deserves to be held with attention rather than grasped with relief. "I will write to Mrs. Penfold," Cecily said. "She has a niece in Bristol who has been neglecting her family obligations. Someone ought to point that out." Something crossed his face. An actual smile, not the brief, barely there event at the corner of his mouth, but the kind that changed the whole geography of a face, scar and all, into something that had been waiting, with considerable patience, for a sufficient occasion. From somewhere behind the balustrade at the top of the staircase, Adelaide made a sound that she made no effort whatsoever to conceal. He looked up at his ward. Adelaide raised both hands in a gesture of entirely vindicated triumph and disappeared back toward the upper corridor without apparent embarrassment. Cecily let her hand fall. He kept his around it, not clutching but careful, held with the kind of attention he had applied, she thought, to everything in his life that he had come to understand actually mattered. Outside, the December light had found an opening in the clouds. It came flat and gold through the entrance hall windows, the way the light came at Dunmore Hall when the morning had decided, against reasonable expectation, to be generous. The trunk stood at the foot of the stairs. The carriage waited on the drive. Neither of them moved to address either of these facts. Down the corridor, through two closed doors, Adelaide Dunmore was making, by the sound of it, absolutely no attempt to contain her satisfaction, and the old hall absorbed it the way old houses absorb what happens in them, with the particular patience of stone that had been standing long enough to understand that most things passed, and a few things, by some mercy, did not.